Chapter 14 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Hay's little dinner. The detective was as good as his word. In a few days Paul was introduced to the editor of a weekly publication and obtained a commission for a story to be written in collaboration with Mr. Hurd. It seemed that the editor was an old acquaintance of Hurd's and had been extricated by him from some trouble connected with cards. The editor, to show his gratitude, and because that Hurd's experiences, thrown in the form of a story, could not fail to interest the public, was only too willing to make a liberal arrangement. Also Paul was permanently engaged to supply short stories, to read those that were submitted to the editor, and, in fact, he permanently became that gentleman's right hand. He was a kind, beery Bohemian of an editor, Scott by name, and took quite a fancy to Paul. "I'll give you £3 a week," said Scott, beaming through his large spectacles and raking his long gray beard with tobacco-stained fingers. "You can live on that, and to earn it you can give me your opinion on the stories. Then between whiles you can talk to Hurd and write this yarn, which I am sure will be interesting. Hurd has had some queer experiences." This was quite true. Hurd had ventured on strange waters, but the strangest he ever sailed on were those connected with the Gwynne Street case. These latter experiences he did not tell to Scott, who was incapable of holding his tongue, and secrecy, as the detective impressed upon Paul, was absolutely necessary to the conduct of the case. "If we keep matters quiet," argued Hurd, "and let those concerned in the matter fancy the case has been dropped, we'll be able to throw them off their guard, and then they may betray themselves." "I wish you would say if you think there is one person or two," said Paul irritably, for his nerves were wearing thin under the strain. "You first talk of the assassin and then of the assassins." "Well," drawled Hurd, smiling, "I'm in the dark, you see, and being only a flesh and blood human being, instead of a creation of one of you authors, I can only grope in the dark and look in every direction for the light. One person, two persons, three, even four, may be engaged in this affair for all I know. Don't you be in a hurry, Mr. Beecot. I believe in that foreign chap's saying, 'Without haste, without rest.'" "Goethe said that." "Then Goethe is a sensible man, and must have read his Bible. 'Make no haste in time of trouble,' says the Scriptures." "Very good," assented Beecot. "Take your own time." "I intend to," said Hurd, coolly. "Bless you, slow and sure is my motto. There's no hurry. You are fixed up with enough to live on, and a prospect of making more. Your young lady is happy enough with that grenadier of a woman, in spite of the humbleness of the home. Mrs. Krill and her daughter are enjoying the 5,000 a year, and Mr. Grexon Hay is fleecing that young ass, Lord George Sandal, as easily as possible. I stand by and watch everything, and when the time comes I'll pounce down on—" "Ah," said Paul, "that's the question. On whom?" "One or two or a baker's dozen," rejoined Hurd, calmly. "My chickens ain't hatched yet, so I don't count 'em. By the way, is your old schoolfellow as friendly as ever?" "Yes. Why?" "I can't understand, as he certainly will make no money out of me. He's giving a small dinner to morrow night at his rooms, and has asked me." "You go," said the detective, emphatically, "and don't let on you have anything to do with me." "See here, Hurd, I won't play the spy, if you mean that." "I don't mean anything of the sort," replied Hurd, earnestly. "But if you do chance to meet Mrs. Krill at this dinner, and if she does chance to drop a few words about her past, you might let me know." "Oh, I don't mind doing that," said Beecot, with relief. "I am as anxious to find out the truth about this murder as you are, if not more so. The truth, I take it, is to be found in Krill's past, before he took the name of Norman. Mrs. Krill will know of that past, and I'll try and learn all I can from her. But Hay has nothing to do with the crime, and I won't spy on him." "Very good. Do what you like. But as to Hay having nothing to do with the matter, I still think Hay stole that opal brooch from you when you were knocked down." "In that case Hay must know who killed Norman," cried Paul, excited. "He just does," rejoined Hurd, calmly. "And now you can understand another reason why I take such an interest in that gentleman." "But you can't be certain." "Quite so. I am in the dark, as I said before. But Hay is a dangerous man, and would do anything to rake in the dollars. He has something to do with the disappearance of that brooch, I'm sure, and if so, he knows more than he says. Besides," here Hurd hesitated. "No, I'll tell you that later." "Tell me what?" "Something about Hay that will astonish you and make you think he has something to do with the crime. Meanwhile, learn all you can from Mrs. Krill." "If I meet her," said Paul, with a shrug. Undoubtedly Hurd knew more than he was prepared to admit, and not even to Paul, staunch as he knew him to be, would he speak confidentially. When the time came the detective would speak out. At present he held his tongue, and moved in clouds like a Homeric deity. But his eyes were on all those connected with the late Aaron Norman, indirectly or directly, although each and every one of them were unaware of the scrutiny. Paul had no scruples in learning all he could from Mrs. Krill. He did not think that she had killed her husband, and probably might be ignorant of the person or persons who had slain the poor wretch in such a cruel manner. But the motive of the crime was to be found in Norman's past, and Mrs. Krill knew all about this. Therefore Paul was very pleased when he found that Mrs. Krill and her daughter were guests at the little dinner. Hay's rooms were large and luxuriously furnished. In effect, he occupied a small flat in the house of an ex-butler, and had furnished the place himself in a sybarite fashion. The ex-butler and his wife and servants looked after Hay, and, in addition, that languid gentleman possessed a slim valet, with a sly face, who looked as though he knew more than was good for him. Indeed, the whole atmosphere of the rooms was shady and fast, and Paul, simple young fellow as he was, felt the bad influence the moment he stepped into the tiny drawing room. This was furnished daintily and with great taste in color and furnishings. It was more like a woman's room, and Mr. Hay had spared no cost in making it pleasing to the eye and comfortable to the body. The prevailing tone was pale yellow, and the electric light suffused itself through lemon-shaded globes. The Louis Quinze furniture was upholstered in primrose, and there were many Persian praying mats and Eastern draperies about the place. Watercolor pictures decked the walls, and numerous mirrors reflected the dainty, pretty apartment. A brisk fire was burning, although the evening was not cold, and everything looked delightfully pleasant. Paul could not help contrasting all this luxury and taste with his bare garret. But with Sylvia's love to warm his heart, he would not have changed places with Grexon Hay for all his splendor. Two ladies were seated by the fire. Mrs. Krill, in black, majestic and calm as usual. She wore diamonds on her breast and jeweled stars in her gray hair. Although not young, she was a wonderfully well preserved woman, and her arms and neck were white, gleaming and beautifully shaped. From the top of her head to the sole of her rather large but well shod foot, she was dressed to perfection, and waved a languid fan as she welcomed Paul, who was presented to her by the host. "I am glad to see you, Mr. Beecot," she said in her deep voice. "We had rather an unhappy interview when last we met. How is Miss Norman?" "She is quite well," replied Paul, in as cordial a tone as he could command. For the sake of learning what he could, he wished to be amiable, but it was difficult when he reflected that this large, suave, smiling woman had robbed Sylvia of a fortune and had spoken of her in a contemptuous way. But Beecot, swallowing down his pride, held his little candle to the devil without revealing his repugnance too openly, and apparently Mrs. Krill believed that his composure was genuine enough, for she was quite at her ease in his presence. The daughter was dressed like the mother, save that she wore pearls in place of diamonds. She talked but little, as usual, and sat smiling, the young image of the older woman. Hay also introduced Paul to a handsome young fellow of 21, with rather a feeble face. This was Lord George Sandal, the pigeon Hay was plucking, and although he had charming manners and an assumption of worldly wisdom, he was evidently one of those who had come into the world saddled and bridled for other folks' riding. A third lady was also present, who called herself Aurora Quehan, and Hay informed his friend in a whisper that she was an actress. Paul then remembered that he had seen her name in the papers as famous in light comedy. She was pretty and kittenish, with fluffy hair and an eternal smile. It was impossible to imagine a greater contrast to the massive firmness of Mrs. Krill than the lively, girlish demeanor of the little woman. Yet Paul had an instinct that Mrs. Quehan, in spite of her profession and odd name and childish giggle, was a more shrewd person than she looked. Everyone was bright and merry and chatty, all save Maud Krill, who smiled and fanned herself in a statuesque way. Hay paid her great attention, and Paul knew very well that he intended to marry the silent woman for her money. It would be hardly earned, he thought, with such a firm-looking mother-in-law as Mrs. Krill would certainly prove to be. The dinner was delightful, well cooked, daintily served, and leisurely eaten. A red-shaded lamp threw a rosy light on the white cloth, the glittering crystal and bright silver. The number of diners was less than the Muses and more than the Graces, and everyone laid himself or herself out to make things bright. And again Maud Krill may be mentioned as an exception. She ate well and held her tongue, merely smiling heavily when addressed. Paul glanced at her serene face across the rosy-hued table, wondering if she really was as calm as she looked, and if she really lacked the brain power her mother seemed to possess. "I'm glad to see you here, Beecot," said Hay, smiling. "I'm very glad to be here," said Paul, adapting himself to circumstances, "especially in such pleasant company." "You don't go out much," said Lord George. "No, I'm a poor author who has yet to win his spurs." "I thought of being an author myself," said the young man, "but it was such a fag to think about things." "You want your material supplied to you, perhaps," put in Mrs. Krill in a calm, contemptuous way. "Oh, no. If I wrote stories like the author Johnny's, I'd rake up my family history. There's lots of fun there." "Your family mightn't like it," giggled Miss Qian. "I know lots of things about my own people which would read delightfully if Mr. Beecot set them down, but then," she shrugged her dainty shoulders, "oh, dear me, what a row there would be." "I suppose there's a skeleton in every cupboard," said Hay, suavely, and quite ignoring the shady tenant in his own. "There's a whole dozen cupboards with skeletons to match in my family," said the young lord. "Why, I had an aunt, Lady Rachel Sandal, who was murdered over 20 years ago. Now," he said, looking triumphantly round the table, "which of you can say there's a murder in your family, ladies and gentlemen?" Paul glanced sideways at Mrs. Krill, wondering what she would say, and wondering also how it was that Lord George did not know she was the widow of the murdered Lemuel Krill, whose name had been so widely advertised. But Hay spoke before anyone could make a remark. "What an unpleasant subject," he said, with a pretended shudder. "Let us talk of less melodramatic things." "Oh, why?" said Mrs. Krill, using her fan. "I rather like to hear about murders." Paul thought for a moment that he did know about the Gwynne Street crime, and intended to remark thereon. But if so, his good taste told him that he would be ill advised to speak, and he turned to ask for another glass of wine. Miss Aurora Quian looked in her pretty shrewd way from one to the other. "I just love the Newgate Calendar," she said, clasping her hands. "There's lovely plots for dramas to be found there. Don't you think so, Mr. Beecot?" "I don't read that sort of literature, Miss Qian." "And then you don't know what people are capable of in the way of cruelty, Mr. Beecot." "I don't want to know," retorted Paul, finding the subject distasteful, and wondering why the actress pressed it, as she undoubtedly did. "I prefer to write stories to elevate the mind." Miss Qian made a grimace and shot a meaning look at him. "It doesn't pay," she said, tittering, "and money is what we all want." "I fear I don't care for money overmuch." "No," said Mrs. Krill to him in an undertone. "I know that from the way you spoke in Mr. Pash's office." "I was standing up for the rights of another." "You will be rewarded," she replied meaningly, but what she did mean Paul could not understand. The rest of the dinner passed off well enough. As the subject was changed, Lord George began to talk of racing, and Hay responded. Mrs. Krill alone seemed shocked. "I don't believe in gambling," she said icily. "I hope you're not very down on it," said Hay. "Lord George and I propose to play bridge with you ladies in the next room." "Maud can play and Miss Qian," said the widow. "I'll talk to Mr. Beecot, unless he prefers the fascination of the green cloth." "I would rather talk to you," replied Paul, bowing. Mrs. Krill nodded, and then went out of the room with the younger ladies. The three gentlemen filled their glasses with port, and Hay passed round a box of cigars. Soon they were smoking and chatting in a most amicable fashion. Lord George talked a great deal about racing and cards, and his bad luck with both. Hay said very little, and every now and then cast a glance at Paul to see how he was taking the conversation. At length, when Sandal became a trifle vehement on the subject of his losses, Hay abruptly changed the subject by refilling his glass and those of his companions. "I want you to drink to the health of my future bride," he said. "What?" cried Paul, staring. "Miss Krill?" "The same," responded Hay, coldly. "You see I have taken your advice and intend to settle. Pash presented me to the ladies when next they came to his office, and since then I have been almost constantly with them. Miss Krill's affections were disengaged, and she, therefore, with her mother's consent, became my promised wife." "I wish you joy," said Lord George, draining his glass and filling another, "and by Jove, for your sake, I hope she's got money." "Oh, yes, she's well off," said Hay, calmly. "And you, Paul?" "I congratulate you, of course," stammered Beecot, dazed. "But it's so sudden. You haven't known her above a month." "5 weeks or so," said Hay, smiling, and sinking his voice lower. He added, "I can't afford to let grass grow under my feet. This young ass here may snap her up, and Mrs. Krill would only be too glad to secure a title for Maud." "I say," said Lord George suddenly, and waking from a brown study, "who is Mrs. Krill? I've heard the name." "It is not an uncommon name," said Hay, untruthfully and quickly. "She is a rich widow who has lately come to London." "Where did she come from?" "I can't tell you that. From the wilds of Yorkshire, I believe. You had better ask her." "Oh, by Jove, no. I wouldn't be so rude. But I seem to know the name." Paul privately thought that if he read the papers he ought to certainly know the name, and he was on the point of making perhaps an injudicious remark, but Hay pointedly looked at him in such a meaning way that he held his tongue. More, when they left their wine for the society of the ladies, Hay squeezed his friend's arm in the passage. "Don't mention the death," he said, using a politer word by preference. "Sandal doesn't connect Mrs. Krill with the dead man. She wants to live the matter down." "In that case she ought to leave London for a time." "She intends to. When I make Maud my wife, We will travel with her mother for a year or two, until the scandal of the murder blows over." Luckily the name of Lemuel Krill was not mentioned often in the papers, and Sandal hasn't seen a handbill that I know of. I suppose you agree with me that silence is judicious?" "Yes," assented Paul, "I think it is." "And you congratulate me on my approaching marriage?" "Certainly. Now perhaps you will live like Falstaff when he was made a knight." Hay did not understand the allusion and looked puzzled. However, he had no time to say more as they entered the drawing room. Almost as soon as they did, Mrs. Krill summoned Paul to her side. "And now," she said, "let us talk of Miss Norman." CHAPter 14